The Dark Ages. The very name conjures images of ignorance, superstition, and decline. 1,000 years of darkness between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. It's one of the most persistent myths in all of history, and almost everything about it is wrong. The term Dark Ages was invented by Petrarch, a 14th-century Italian scholar who wanted to make his own era look better. He looked back at the centuries after Rome's fall and saw only what he wanted to see. Later Renaissance thinkers ran with the idea, painting the entire medieval period as a 1,000-year gap in human progress. But the truth is far more interesting and far more complex. Today, we're going to take you on a journey through the real Middle Ages. Not the myth of darkness and superstition, but a world of innovation, exploration, and cultural transformation. By the end of this video, you'll never think about the Dark Ages the same way again. Let's start at the beginning. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Europe didn't simply descend into chaos. Yes, there was instability. The Roman administrative system collapsed. Long-distance trade routes that had connected Britain to North Africa and Spain to Syria suddenly fell apart. Cities that had housed tens of thousands of people shrank to a fraction of their former size. The great Roman roads fell into disrepair. But this wasn't the end of civilization. It was a transformation. New kingdoms rose to take Rome's place. The Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Spain, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Ostrogoths in Italy. These weren't barbarians destroying civilization, they were building new ones, blending Roman institutions with their own traditions. The Visigoths, for example, preserved Roman law and even produced one of the most sophisticated legal codes of the early Middle Ages. And then there was Clovis, king of the Franks. In 496 AD, he converted to Christianity, an act that would shape European history for the next 1,000 years. By allying with the Church, Clovis gained legitimacy and administrative support. The Frankish kingdom grew into the most powerful state in Western Europe, laying the foundation for what would eventually become France and Germany. But the real game-changer came 3 centuries later with Charlemagne. Charlemagne is one of the most misunderstood figures in history. Crowned emperor in 800 AD, he ruled an empire that stretched from modern-day France to Germany, from Italy to the North Sea. He fought wars, sure, he was a medieval king, after all. But his greatest legacy wasn't military. It was intellectual. Charlemagne couldn't read or write himself, but he understood the value of knowledge. He summoned the best scholars from across Europe to his court. He demanded that every monastery in his empire establish a school. He ordered the collection and copying of ancient manuscripts, not just religious texts, but works of philosophy, history, poetry, and science. This was the Carolingian Renaissance, and it saved Western civilization. Without Charlemagne's efforts, many of the classical texts we have today, from Cicero to Virgil, from Ovid to Seneca, would have been lost forever. The very idea of a Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries was only possible because Charlemagne's scholars had preserved the raw materials. But the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't the only intellectual movement of the Middle Ages. Far from it. The 12th century saw an explosion of learning that historians call the Renaissance of the 12th century. Universities were founded across Europe: Bologna in 1088, Paris in 1150, Oxford in 1167, Cambridge in 1209. These weren't just religious schools. They were centers of genuine intellectual inquiry where scholars debated philosophy, medicine, law, and science. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest philosophers in Western history, was a medieval scholar. So was Roger Bacon, who wrote about gunpowder, magnifying glasses, and flying machines centuries before they became reality. The scientific method didn't begin with Galileo, its roots are in the medieval university system. And what about technology? This is where the myth of the Dark Ages really falls apart. The Middle Ages gave us the heavy plow, which transformed agriculture by allowing farmers to till the dense, heavy soils of northern Europe. The 3-field crop rotation system doubled food production and helped end the cycle of famine. The horse collar allowed horses to pull plows efficiently for the first time, replacing slower oxen. The windmill and the water mill mechanized labor in ways not seen since ancient Rome. But it didn't stop there. The Middle Ages gave us the mechanical clock, revolutionizing how people understood time. Eyeglasses, which extended the working lives of scholars and craftsmen. The blast furnace, which made iron production more efficient. The spinning wheel, which transformed textile production. The button, which changed how people dressed. And the chimney, which allowed buildings to be heated without filling them with smoke. Medieval ships were the most advanced in the world. The combination of the lateen sail, the stern-mounted rudder, and the magnetic compass allowed European ships to sail further and more safely than ever before. These weren't primitive vessels. They were the technology that would eventually enable Columbus to cross the Atlantic. And speaking of explorers, the Vikings. The Vikings are often portrayed as mindless raiders, burning monasteries and terrorizing coastal villages. And yes, they did raid. But that's only half the story. The Vikings were master shipbuilders whose longships could sail an open ocean and navigate shallow rivers. They were explorers who reached North America around the year 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus. They founded the first cities in Ireland and established trade routes that connected Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world. They served as elite mercenaries for the Byzantine emperor. They founded the Rus state, which would eventually become Russia. Viking traders brought silk from Constantinople, spices from Baghdad, and silver from Central Asia back to Northern Europe. They weren't peripheral figures in medieval history. They were at the center of a global trade network. Now let's talk about something the Middle Ages is famous for, but not in the way you think. The medieval church is often portrayed as an enemy of knowledge and progress. The reality is far more complicated. While there were certainly instances of suppression, the trial of Galileo being the most famous, though that happened in the 17th century, while after the Middle Ages, the Church was also the greatest preserver of knowledge in European history. Monasteries across Europe functioned as libraries, schools, and research centers. Monks spent their entire lives copying manuscripts by hand, preserving not just religious texts but the entire corpus of classical learning. Without the monastic scriptoria, we would have lost almost everything we know about ancient Greece and Rome. The Church also funded the construction of the greatest architectural achievements of the Middle Ages. The Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres, Cologne, Salisbury, were engineering marvels that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Their flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and stained glass windows weren't just beautiful. They were technological innovations that allowed buildings to reach heights never before achieved. Building a Gothic cathedral took generations. The workers who built them weren't slaves, they were skilled craftsmen who passed their knowledge from father to son. The masons, carpenters, and glassmakers of the Middle Ages were the engineers of their day. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, bad things happened in the Middle Ages. The Black Death killed between 30 and 50% of Europe's population. Religious intolerance was real. Life was hard for the majority of people. But here's the thing, every era has its dark sides. The Romans crucified thousands. The Renaissance had the Inquisition. The Enlightenment had the slave trade. The 20th century had 2 world wars. Judging an entire millennium by its worst moments isn't history. It's propaganda. The term Dark Ages tells us more about the people who invented it than it does about the period itself. Petrarch and the Renaissance humanists needed a dark past to make their own achievements shine brighter. It was a marketing campaign, not a historical analysis. Today, historians don't use the term Dark Ages. They talk about late antiquity, the early Middle Ages, and the high Middle Ages. These terms aren't just more accurate, they're more honest. They describe a period of genuine historical change without the baggage of medieval fantasy. So the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were 1,000 years of darkness, ask them some questions. Ask them about Charlemagne's schools. Ask them about the first universities. Ask them about Gothic cathedrals. Ask them about the heavy plow, the mechanical clock, eyeglasses, and the blast furnace. The Middle Ages weren't a gap in human progress. They were a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. And like any bridge, they were built by real people, with real skills, working toward real goals. We call it the Dark Ages because it's easier than learning the truth. But the truth is infinitely more interesting. The people of the medieval world were just as clever, just as creative, and just as human as we are. They built civilizations, preserved knowledge, explored new worlds, and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The real Dark Age would be forgetting everything they accomplished. Thanks for watching Historia 4K. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We release new documentaries every week, uncovering the stories that shaped our world. The past is never as dark as we imagine, and the truth is always more fascinating than the myth.